Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the strange, stubborn heart of the Middle Ages, a world of mud, monks, and makeshift fixes that somehow became cornerstones of civilization. You'd think most of it would have crumbled like bad plaster, but no. Some of the most permanent pieces of our modern world began as stopgaps, emergency plans, or outright accidents. Fair warning, you probably wouldn't survive it. Plague, war, famine, political backstabbing, it's hardly spa-day material. But you're lucky. You're in bed or sprawled on your couch, eyes half closed, drifting into a realm of iron and incense. So before you settle in, take a moment to like this if it speaks to you, and subscribe only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. No fake love, just real bedtime history vibes. Drop a comment with your city, and when you're listening, I love knowing where you are in the world now. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We start in a smoky, candlelit hall in Wessex, England. Nothing's going according to plan. Viking raids pound the coastline like clockwork. The reigning monarch, the Thellard, is as stable as a one-legged stool. When he dies, the kingdom doesn't just need a new king, it needs a miracle. Enter Alfred, young, bookish, and definitely not the first choice. Alfred is crowned in a hurry, grab the nearest bishop kind of hurry. It's meant to be temporary, a wartime decision, a placeholder crown until someone more suitable appears. But Alfred, as it turns out, is built different. He doesn't just hold the line, he rebuilds the kingdom, trains a standing army, sets up a navy, and casually revives education and literacy while he's at it. The guy is like if you blended Abraham Lincoln, Tony Stark, and a very tired school teacher and dropped him into medieval England. He fights off the Danes, negotiates peace, and reorganizes the realm. Suddenly, that emergency crown isn't so temporary anymore. And here's the thing, Alfred's rule creates a precedent. His successors, his grandchildren, and even the very idea of England as a unified realm all trace back to this moment. The man who was never supposed to be king ends up remembered as Alfred the Great, the only English monarch ever to bear that title. His reign becomes a blueprint for kingship itself. Here's the quirky bit. Alfred might have had a strange obsession with translating Latin texts into English personally. He didn't just commission it. He did it one page at a time. Some scholars think it was out of genuine passion. Others believe it was because nobody around him was literate enough to do it. And what's still debated whether Alfred ever actually wanted to be king at all. Some accounts suggest he was deeply religious and more drawn to monastic life than politics. But desperate times make for strange coronations. Whether he wanted it or not, he held power and changed the trajectory of an entire island. Now imagine this. You're in a mud-walled village somewhere in Alfred's England. You don't know what Latin is. Your teeth are falling out, and you've never seen the sea even though it's just 20 miles away. Yet the decisions made by this supposedly temporary king are about to shape your children's lives, your land, your taxes, even the church you attend, which probably doubles as a granary and local hangout spot. Fast forward, Alfred dies, but the monarchy he stabilizes lives on. His grandsons continue his mission, and by the time the Normans arrive, you've got a real kingdom. Laws, borders, cultural, built on a panicked wartime decision, and Alfred's legacy echoes beyond England. Later monarchs across Europe would look to his rule as a model for consolidating fractured regions. In the rhythms of his governance, you hear the first murmurs of the modern nation-state. So yes, one emergency crown slapped on the wrong brother in a crisis ends up laying the foundation for 1,000 years of monarchy, nationalism, and mildly insulting British comedies. Makes you wonder what temporary thing in your own life might outlive you. Now picture this. You're standing on a rocky outcrop in northern France. Wind howls through your hood, mud splashes up to your knees, and you're staring at a half-finished wooden fortress. It's called a Matanda. And no, it's not a desert teat, the medieval equivalent of a pop-up shop. Only instead of selling overpriced candles, it's designed to repel angry neighbors and marauding war bands. The Normans brought this design to England after Hastings. The idea is simple. Dig a mound the motte, slap a wooden tower on top, then wrap it all in a wobbly wall and a ditch. Voila, instant castle. And here's the key, it's not meant to last. These were stopgaps, emergency shelters, to assert control over newly conquered lands, like leaving your suitcase on the hotel bed to claim the room. Lords figured they'd build something sturdier later, maybe once the area was secure, and they weren't dodging peasant revolts or rival nobles with bigger egos, but later turned into decades. And decades into centuries, because something funny happened. People started to like castles, not just for military advantage, which was obvious, but for the power they symbolized. Roll into a village with your house on a hill, surrounded by sharpened stakes and a drawbridge, and you send a message. Especially if you're the only one with plumbing and a murder hole. Would turn to stone. Defensive designs got fancier, walls higher, towers rounder, kitchens warmer. Over time, castles evolved from battlefield command posts into full-blown estates. The shift from war pod to noble residence was gradual, like watching your gym buddy slowly become a wine snob. But it happened. Those once temporary fortifications became permanent fixtures on the landscape and in the imagination. Quirky fact, some castles had fake walls built inside the real ones, decoy mazes. One wrong turn, and you're in a dead-end hallway full of boiling oil. Talk about home security. The most famous of these awkward transitions. Windsor Castle. What began as a simple Norman fort in the 11th century is now one of the longest occupied royal residences in the world, going from temporary lookout post, the site of a globally televised royal wedding with barely a pause. And it's not alone. Across Europe, these, just until we stabilized the region structures, became family homes, government offices, prisons, museums, and, once, famously, the location for a goat-themed coronation party. Long story. But not everyone agreed on what castles were even for. Scholars still argue whether they were primarily military or social institutions. Some say tools of feudal oppression, concrete reminders of who owned the land, the food, and probably you. Others argue castles were more symbolic than strategic, especially later, when warfare outpaced their usefulness. Gunpowder kind of ruined the walls are enough vibe. Still, the psychological power of a castle endured. Even today, people visit them with reverence, walking through mossy archways and peering into arrow slits as if they might uncover noble blood in their own veins. And let's be honest, castles are cool. That's why every fantasy novel, video game, or theme park still clings to the image, pointy towers, moats, stone halls, echoing with secrets. They got under our skin. Imagine you're a stonemason in the 13th century, hired to work on a curtain wall. You think, all right, this job'll last a few years, then I'll move on. Fast forward 200 years, and that same wall still stands, weathered but proud. Meanwhile, your name is forgotten, your tools rusted, and your great-great-grandkids are paying taxes to a duke who drinks wine in the solar where guards once sharpened swords. And this leads to a strange truth. Many medieval castles weren't abandoned because they failed, they were abandoned because they succeeded. They lasted so long they outlived their purpose. Their owners got comfortable. Fireplaces were added. Curtains appeared. Kitchens stopped serving stew and started serving roast swan with fig glaze. By the late Middle Ages, castles were less about defense and more about prestige, diplomacy, and family drama. Game of Thrones didn't invent the castle soap opera. It just updated it with dragons and snark. So next time you see a castle perched on a hill, looking like it's always belonged there, remember, it probably wasn't supposed to. It was a quick fix, a wooden box with a dream. But something about that elevated perch and thick stone wall kept us coming back, kept us building, kept us believing that maybe permanence could grow out of panic. All right. So let's say you're a local nobleman around the year 875. The Roman Empire has been gone for centuries, though people are still in denial. Roads are crumbling. There's no postal system. The nearest thing to law is whatever your uncle mumbles through a mouthful of stew at the village moot. Trade, barely a thing. Central government, not really. So how do you keep order? How do you run anything without emperors, legions, or even a reliable map? You do what any underprepared manager would do. You delegate. You carve up your territory like a pizza at a kid's party, hand out slices to your most trusted or most dangerous followers and hope they stay loyal. This is how feudalism is born, not from some grand plan, but as a slapdash solution to total systems failure. It starts small. A local lord gives a patch of land a fief to a vassal in exchange for military service. That's the deal. Sword for soil, loyalty for lunch. And it kind of works. Villages are tied to the land. Knights are tied to their lords. And lords are supposedly tied to kings. The whole system is held together by promises, threats, and a terrifying lack of written contracts. Like a group project where everyone's holding the same fragile Jenga tower and pretending they know the rules. The original idea, totally temporary. Just a fix until things stabilize. Once kings have armies again, trade returns, and central authority recovers. Surely we'll move on from this cobbled-together loyalty web, but we never really do. Feudalism sinks in like stubborn moss. By the high Middle Ages, entire economies, legal codes, and even religious structures are wrapped around this once hasty setup. Lords aren't just landowners, they're miniature kings. Peasants are legally glued to the soil. Knights become their own weird social class, somewhere between deadly mercenary and Renaissance fair enthusiast. Here's the quirky twist. No one at the time used the word feudalism. That's a later invention, cooked up by historians trying to make sense of the mess. People living through it didn't think, what a splendidly feudal society we enjoy. They just called it life, and Probably not cheerfully. So what's still up for debate? Pretty much everything. Scholars have argued for decades whether feudalism was even a real system or just a label we used to group loosely connected customs. Was it about land, loyalty, a social pyramid, or a web of messy obligations? No consensus. It's like trying to describe a dream after waking up. Everyone remembers it differently. And let's not forget how deeply weird it got. Over time, the feudal contract became hereditary. A knight's fief could pass to his son even if that son had never held a sword. Lords ended up with more vassals than they could manage. Loyalty lines blurred. Wars broke out because someone swore fealty to two nobles who hated each other. At one point, vassals had vassals who had vassals passing favors like a chain letter with horses. The unintended result. Feudalism created a layered cake of power where even kings were technically vassals. The King of England, for instance, held land in France and owed fealty to the French king. That went about as well as you'd expect. Spoiler, they fought 100-year war over it. Meanwhile, down on the ground, serfs, the peasants, legally bound to the land, had no mobility. Born on a plot, that's where you live, work, marry, and die. You couldn't leave without permission. Temporary poverty became generational status. And once landholding became hereditary, that status got baked into your family line like an unfortunate genetic curse. Now imagine you're one of those peasants, scratching at the soil in exchange for protection that mostly means being ignored. Your local lord rides by once a month to yell about wheat quotas. The only other authority is a priest who spends half his time reminding you that suffering is holy. And even though everyone around you mumbles that this is just how things are, somewhere in your aching spine, you know it wasn't supposed to be permanent. But time is funny. Give any system long enough, and people start calling it tradition. Kings legitimize their rule through feudal titles. Nobles pass down lands and obligations as if God himself signed off. Even the church gets in on it, acquiring land and acting like a feudal lord, except with extra incense and less bathing. Eventually, feudalism doesn't just shape the land, it shapes the mind. The idea that everyone has a place, that those at the top deserve to be there, that loyalty matters more than logic, it all becomes embedded in culture. Songs, stories, even bedtime tales, to scare children into obedience. So, the next time someone calls feudalism a brilliant medieval invention, remember, it started as duct tape over a collapsing world, a temporary fix in the ruins of empire. But people got used to it, built around it, and forgot it was never meant to stay. Let's say you're a farmer in 12th century France, minding your own business, trying to coax wheat from cold, stingy earthwind. A local priest comes knocking. He's not here for tea. He's here for your tithe. 1/10 of everything you've scraped together. Grain, chickens, wine, labor. If it exists, it can be tithed. And the worst part, this whole thing was supposed to be temporary, a one-time emergency fund. God needs it, they said. The church needs it just until we get through the latest famine, war, or plague. But of course, it never goes away. The tithe begins as spiritual generosity. Early church leaders wanted to mimic Old Testament practices, encouraging people to give 1/10 to support clergy, build churches, and help the poor. Fair enough. Everyone pitches in for the greater good, but by the Middle Ages, the voluntary part vanishes. The tithe becomes as permanent as dirt. Not paying it doesn't just earn side-eye. Can get you excommunicated or sued in ecclesiastical court, which is like regular court, but with more Latin and less mercy. Quirky side note, some places didn't just tithe produce, they tithed bees. Monasteries collected honey and even wax for candles as part of the tithe. Try explaining to a church official why your bees underperformed. This season, what started as charity turned into a sprawling system of wealth transfer, one that made the church the single largest landowner in medieval Europe. In a world where most lived on, the church managed vast estates, collected rents, and stockpiled grain, all built on a tax never meant to be permanent. And here's the kicker. The tithe wasn't just about money, it was about control. By taking a piece of everyone's livelihood, the church inserted itself into daily life in a very material way. That field you plow, one row goes to God. That cow you raise, every 10th calf is sacred property. Even your orchard, say goodbye to a basket of apples each season. It wasn't just taxation, it was spiritual landlordship. Scholars still debate how mandatory the tithe really was. In some areas, enforcement was lax, more guilt than punishment. In others, bishops kept ledgers and sent enforcers after holdouts. And the rules varied wildly. Tithe on what you produced or what you earned. What if your land was barren? The ambiguity wasn't accidentally, gave local clergy all the wiggle room they needed to interpret the tithe in ways that always benefited them. Eventually, the tithe shaped local economies. Farmers planted crops not based on soil or weather, but on which yields would sting less when tithed. Some avoided grapes altogether because they couldn't afford to lose wine. Others shifted to weaving or blacksmithing just to dodge the spiritual taxman. Imagine how strange this would look to someone from ancient Rome. The empire had taxes, sure, but they didn't take your sheep in the name of spiritual purity. In medieval Europe, entire villages were structured around meeting tithe obligations. And priests had barns bigger than the farmers they served. Here's where it gets weirder. Over time, tithes weren't even going to local churches. Wealthy abbeys and bishops started leasing the right to collect them to nobles or middlemen. People could literally buy your tithe in advance and then collect it like rent. It's like someone buying the rights to your taxes and charging interest on top. Medieval Wall Street in holy robes. And that's when resentment boiled over. By the 14th and 15th centuries, peasants were done broke, hungry, and furious that the holiest people acted more like bankers than shepherds. Tithes became a lightning rod for rebellion. During the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, one of the first demands was, burn the tithe records. Burn them all. Yet even after revolts, reforms, and revolutions, the tithes persisted in some places well into the 19th century. Nearly 1,000 years of what began as a temporary spiritual donation became one of the most resented obligations in European history. Now you're lying in bed, maybe wondering if the apps on your phone or the subscriptions you barely remember signing up for will someday become institutional bedrocks of society. Maybe your great-great-grandkids will still be paying for that streaming bundle that was just a free trial. In the Middle Ages, Nothing spread like fire unless it came with the scent of authority. The tithe-born of good intentions and emergency need end up shaping how people farmed, prayed, and rebelled. A temporary patchwork tax that stuck to civilization. Like candle wax on stone. Let's slide into another oops that lasted forever. Medieval moments, this time inside the echoing stone walls of a king's hall. Picture a long, drafty room lit by flickering torches, stuffed with nobles in itchy wool, trying very hard not to look too ambitious or too expendable. The king sits on a slightly raised chair, more symbolic than comfortable. He clears his throat, nods to his advisors, and says, "So, what should I do?" Believe it or not, this is the birth of Parliament. Originally, it's nothing fancy. Kings often called their most powerful nobles and clergy for advice or, more often, to beg for money. These weren't elected officials. They were landowners, barons, and bishops whose wealth and influence the king couldn't ignore. It wasn't about representation, it was damage control. These councils were meant to be ad hoc one-time gatherings to solve short-term problems. Once the money was raised, everyone went home, done, over, temporary. But it didn't end. People noticed something. When the king had to ask for input, it meant he wasn't all-powerful. Nobles realized that by withholding funds, they could shape policy. Soon, these councils started demanding concessions in exchange for support. You want gold for a crusade? Great, but maybe we talk about how you're jailing peasants without trial, or that weird thing with your foreign mercenaries. By the 13th century, under Henry III and Edward I, these councils take a more formal shape. They're no longer just called when needed, they become expected. Then, institutionalized, the English Parliament unofficially begins, with Simon de Montfort's gathering in 1265. He invites not just nobles, but commoners, knights, and burgesses to represent local regions. That move, wild, revolutionary, and say it with me. People noticed something. When the king had to ask for input, it meant he wasn't all-powerful. Nobles realized that by withholding funds, they could shape policy. Soon, these councils started demanding concessions in exchange for support. You want gold for a crusade? Great, but maybe we talk about how you're jailing peasants without trial, or that weird thing with your foreign mercenaries. By the 13th century, under Henry III and Edward I, these councils take a more formal shape. They're no longer just called when needed, they become expected. Then institutionalized, the English Parliament unofficially begins with Simon de Montfort's gathering in 1265. He invites not just nobles, but commoners, knights, and burgesses too, represent local regions that move wild, revolutionary, and say it with mean, not meant to last, but it did. Suddenly, townspeople who'd never had a voice in national decisions are riding to London to argue about taxes and laws. They don't have real power yet, but they're in the room, watching, taking notes, and kings keep needing money. War is expensive as when your horse wears armor. Quirky detail. Early parliamentary sessions were so chaotic that people brought their own benches. No assigned seats, no microphones, just men in cloaks, shouting over each other while trying to out-polite the guy who owns half of Kent. If you wanted to speak, you needed lungs, charm, and a good connection. Historians still debate what counts as the first true parliament? Was it the Witnagemote in Anglo-Saxon England, the Curia Regis under the Normans, or de Montfort's assembly with both nobles and commoners? Scholars can't agree, partly because medieval record-keeping blends dry Latin with passive-aggressive complaints. But what's clear is this: something unexpected grew out of necessity. Kings kept calling meetings to solve short-term problems, and those meetings kept carving deeper grooves into governance. Over centuries, temporary councils morphed into permanent institutions. Power slowly bled from crown to council. By the 14th and 15th centuries, king in parliament becomes standard. Monarchs now rule with parliament not above it, at least in theory. And while kings still threw their weight around, looking at you, Charles the Thin, the notion that no ruler could govern alone became embedded in England's political DNA and later in nations that took notes. Here's the ultimate irony: today's democratic structures, hailed as triumphs of the people, balance and law trace their roots too desperate. Thrown together meetings between nervous kings and nobles who mostly wanted to protect their land. Taxes. Imagine you're a blacksmith in a small English village around 1300. You've never left your county. Your knees crack every time you hammer a horseshoe. And the most powerful person you've ever spoken to is the reeve who collects your lord's grain. Then one day, you hear your neighbor, the literate knight with the decent beards, going to London to speak on your region's behalf. You don't know what he'll say, or if it'll matter, but it feels like something is changing. Of course, it's not democracy as we know it. Let's not romanticize it. Early parliaments were packed with elites, and voting, if it happened, was tightly controlled. But the idea of it, the presence of council, of check and balance, of consultation before taxation, planted a seed, and that seed eventually grew into constitutional monarchy, legislative debate, and full-scale democracy in places you'd never expect. Looking at you, New Zealand. So here's to another medieval fix that never expired. A short-term council to solve a royal money crisis becomes the slow birth of parliamentary government, not through revolution, but through repetition. Not because someone had a vision, but because kings were desperate and people were paying attention. All right, time for something truly weird. You're living in 12th century Europe. You've finally scraped together enough money to send your son to school, not as we know it, but a dim room full of chanting boys and a monk who smells like pickled onions. And what's the first thing your kid has to learn? Latin. Not French, not English, not your local dialect, but Latin, a language nobody actually speaks at home anymore, unless your home is a crumbling villa in the ruins of the Western Roman Empire. So why Latin? Because what began as a temporary patch after Rome fell became the default language of the educated world, and it stuck around like that one piece of wallpaper you never get around to peeling off the church. Scholars, lawyers, doctors, they all communicated in this language that hadn't been anyone's mother tongue for centuries. Latin was a ghost tongue, wandering through monasteries and courtrooms long after its empire vanished. Originally, it made sense. When Rome collapsed, Latin was still the common denominator across Europe. The Church, wanting consistency, kept using it for services, scripture, and communication. It wasn't meant to last forever, just a placeholder, so monks in Ireland and bishops in Sicily could understand each other. like using emojis when you don't share a language. But then time passed, and nobody updated the system, even as spoken languages evolved into French, Spanish, Italian, and German. Latin just hung in there, stubborn and smug. Like the old guy at the gym who insists on the rowing machine and still wears tube socks from 1974. Everyone's moved on, but there he is, rowing away, Latin conjugations and all. Quirky detail: many medieval students learned Latin by rote before understanding a word. Kids chanted full prayers, legal phrases, even insults without knowing what they meant. A generation of accidental Latin parrots reciting amas, while secretly dreaming of becoming sheep farmers. The church was the biggest Latin hoarder. Attend Mass anywhere in medieval Europe, and you'd hear Latin no matter what you spoke. The priest might not even understand it fluently, but the rules were the rules. Bible, Latin. PayPal letters, Latin. Sermons about tithing and sinning, less. Also, Latin. The problem: the average villager had about as much chance of understanding it. Latin was the language of instruction. Lectures, notes, debates about Aristotle or unicorns, all in Latin. It wasn't just a language anymore. It was a gatekeeper. No Latin, you were locked out of education, law, theology, any serious conversation. It turned learning into a secret club, and the password was always dead, and unnecessarily complicated. Now, here's the debate. Did Latin truly unify Europe or just freeze intellectual development? On one hand, yes, it gave scholars a common ground. A philosopher in Oxford could, in theory, read a theologian in Bologna without a translator. On the other, it bottled up knowledge. Works had to be in Latin to be taken seriously, even as vernacular languages grew rich and expressive. Some say this delayed national literature, stifled public access to ideas, and forced everything through the church's filter. Eventually, things shifted. The Renaissance helped. So did the printing press. Writers like Dante, Chaucer, and Luther began using vernacular languages, and the Protestant Reformation kicked the Latin monopoly right in its cassock. Suddenly, people wanted Bibles they could read, sermons they could understand, prayers that didn't sound like courtroom depositions. But Latin didn't go quietly. Universities clung to it. The church didn't officially abandon Latin Mass until the 1960s. The 1960s, the Beatles were singing about holding hands, and some churches were still chanting in the voice of a dead empire. Imagine you're a 14th century scribe. You've trained for years to master Latin script. You write contracts no one reads, your fingers permanently stained with ink. Then along comes some poet writing in French, and suddenly everyone calls it the language of the people. You want to scream, but in Latin, because it still counts more. Even now, we carry Latin's fingerprints everywhere. Legal terms, medical jargon, the silent grammar beneath modern thought, echoing through centuries in the quiet architecture of our words. Scientific classification: Homo sapiens, habitus corpus, in vino veritas. You've probably quoted Latin without even knowing it. It's like the ghost of the Middle Ages whispering into your ears every time you walk into a law office or read the back of a medicine bottle. So next time someone tells you Latin is a dead language, you can calmly remind them it was never supposed to live this long in the first place. It was just a placeholder temporary patch for a world in ruins. But like so many things medieval, it got comfortable. It unpacked its bags. It refused to leave. And now it's still squatting in our libraries, our universities, and maybe, just maybe, your bedtime history videos. All right. Grab your metaphorical sword and throw on something flame retardant, because we're taking a little trip to the Holy Land, or at least the medieval fantasy version of it. A pope stands before a crowd of knights who haven't been paid in years. Peasants desperate for something better than another famine, and nobles with more sons than inheritances. He raises his voice, invokes God, and boom, the first crusade is born. Here's the kicker. This was supposed to be a one-time thinga, holy pilgrimage, just with more stabbing. The pitch was simple. Go to Jerusalem. Take it back from the Muslims who'd held it for centuries, and cleanse your sins along the way. Die, straight ticket to heaven. Live, potentially get rich, gain land, and come home a war hero. Either way, you win. It was like a divine grouping for salvation. What could go wrong? Everything, basically. The First Crusade becomes a wild, ragtag march of disorganized zealots, starving peasants, opportunistic nobles, and a few actual The First Crusade becomes a wild, ragtag march of disorganized zealots, starving peasants, opportunistic nobles, and a few actual trained knights. Against all odds and a lot of infighting, they reach Jerusalem and take the city in a siege so violent it reportedly left ankle-deep blood in the streets, and instead of dusting their hands off and going home, they stay. They carve out little kingdoms, call dibs on everything, and set up what are essentially medieval European micronations in the middle of the Levant. But now there's a problem. If you hold Jerusalem, you have to defend it. Cue the Second Crusade, then a third, then a fourth, then the Children's Crusade. Yes, that happened. Suddenly, this once-and-done holy war becomes a century-spanning international habit like smoking, but with more chainmail. Here's a quirky fact. The Fourth Crusade never even made it to the Holy Land. Instead, it got sidetracked by internal politics and ended up sacking Constantinople, Christian city. That's right. In an effort to fight Muslims, Crusaders attacked their fellow Christians, looted their churches, and dismantled one of the most important cities in the world. Classic Crusade detour. And what do scholars still debate today? The real motivations behind the Crusades. Were they genuinely about religious devotion, or just a convenient excuse for land-hungry nobles to carve out territories and for popes to consolidate power? Some argue it was pure piety. Others say it was more about politics and population control. When you've got too many unemployed knights sitting around, starting a distant war is sometimes easier than dealing with local rebellions. Back in Europe, the Crusades had unexpected side effects. They introduced people to spices, silk, and advanced math. Crusaders brought back exotic goods, Arabic knowledge, and, unfortunately, more debt than they could handle. Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa made fat profits off crusade logistics, transporting men and materials in exchange for influence and cold, hard coin. The result? The growth of powerful merchant empires and a rise in aggressive capitalism wrapped in a crusader cloak. And then there's the storytelling. The Crusades become myth almost immediately. Medieval poets sing about heroic battles and divine intervention. Knights start putting little crosses on their shields, not because they were ever in Jerusalem, but because it looked cool and made them seem holier. Suddenly, you're not just a soldier, you're a defender of Christendom. Even if you mostly just drank too much wine and lost your horse outside Antioch. Imagine you're a teenager in 12th century France. Your uncle fought in the First Crusade and came back with a limp. A questionable story about fighting a dragon, actually a catapult, and a shiny ring he insists is holy. Your village priest talks about the Crusades like their mandatory summer camp one day. You too will go and probably die gloriously. It's all so normal now. No one even remembers a time before the church was sending thousands of people to fight in places they couldn't find on a map, and once the actual fighting dies down, the crusader mentality sticks. It filters into literature, politics, and identity. Europe becomes Christendom defined, less by shared culture and more by who it's at war with. This us versus them worldview hardens. Eventually, that spirit finds new targets: pagans in the Baltic, heretics in France, even rival Christian sects. The original Jerusalem goal fades, replaced by a general itch to purify the world, one siege at a time. By the late Middle Ages, the Crusades are less about marching east and more about an entire ideology that won't sit down. It gets baked into the culture, the songs, the symbols, the architecture, Templar churches, even the economy. Knights who never left home still call themselves crusaders. Popes keep issuing crusade bulls like they're trying to hit a quota. At one point, there's even a crusade against Florence. Of all places. Even today, the term crusade hasn't gone away. It's morphed metaphorically now to mean any righteous cause or relentless campaign. But the echoes are still there, all from what was supposed to be a single holy road trip, one journey, one goal, one temporary act of divine cleanup duty. So here's the takeaway: the Crusades weren't born with the intention of becoming centuries-long geopolitical quagmires. They started as a desperate attempt to unify fractured Europe and reclaim a city most villagers couldn't even imagine. But like everything else medieval, once people saw the glory, the loot, and the legacy, they couldn't let it go. What was supposed to be a single chapter turned into an entire volume and then some. Now let's say you've just been accused of stealing a chicken. Or maybe someone claims you hexed their cow into not giving milk. You're standing barefoot in the village square, surrounded by gawkers, priests, and someone suspiciously holding a vat of boiling water. This is not a good sign. Welcome to trial by ordeal, a legal system so bizarre, so drenched in superstition and sweat. It could only have come from a world where divine judgment was expected to literally burn the truth into your flesh. And the best part, this whole mess was originally supposed to be temporary, just a placeholder, until the legal system got its act together. But, surprise, it stuck around for centuries. Here's how it worked. When evidence was scarce, medieval evidence gathering was basically one guy shouting, "He did it." You'd be asked to prove your innocence by undergoing a physical test. There were three main flavors of ordeal. Ordeal by fire usually meant sticking your hand into a pot of boiling water to retrieve a ring or stone. You'd be bandaged, and a priest would check the wound days later. If it healed cleanly, you were innocent. If it got infected, which, let's be real, it always did, you were guilty. Ordeal by water was even better. You'd be bound and thrown into a river. If you floated, the water had rejected you guilty. If you sank, congrats, you were innocent, though also probably dead. Now, here's the quirky bit. This whole practice was framed as letting God make the decision. People weren't being judged by kings or juries. They were, in theory, standing before the Almighty Himself. The priest would say a few words, and boom, you're playing hot potato with your eternal soul. If you were innocent, God would miraculously protect you. If not, better luck in the afterlife. And here's where it gets even weirder. There was a very specific, almost theatrical process. The ordeal had to take place in sacred space. The tools were blessed. The water was holy. There were prayers, fasts, and rituals meant to purify everyone involved. It wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a liturgical event. People showed up like it was church, with a side of burn trauma. What's debated today among historians is whether these ordeals were ever taken completely seriously. Some believe they were symbolic tests rigged to let known innocents off the hook. Maybe the priest slightly cooled the water or didn't bind someone too tightly before tossing them in the river. Others argue participants genuinely believed God would intervene, which says a lot about the medieval mindset. The divine and the legal weren't just linked, they were practically roommates. Imagine you're the local blacksmith, and your neighbor accuses you of cursing his daughter with a fever because you once looked at her funny while hammering a horseshoe. No one saw you do anything. There's no evidence, just gossip and fear. And suddenly, you're barefoot at dawn, standing in a chapel, hands extended over a cauldron. Everyone's watching, some out of fear, some for the spectacle. The priest finishes the chant. You plunge your hand in, and somewhere in the back of your mind, you realize law and religion are once again besties in all the worst ways. But wait, it doesn't end there. There's also ordeal by combat, where two parties physically fight to determine guilt. This was mostly reserved for nobility, because peasant legal duels weren't exactly high stakes. The idea? God ensures the innocent wins. So if you're a weak, sickly baron going up against a battle-hardened knight who eats raw boar for breakfast, well, maybe you should have gone with boiling water. Quirky aside, trial by combat was technically still legal in some places, way longer than it should have been. In fact, there was an actual legal case in Britain in the early 1800s where someone tried to invoke it. The judge had to awkwardly say, okay, yes, technically, this is still on the books. But no. So why did this all last so long? Because no one had a better idea. When central authority was weak, literacy low, and social trust even lower, trial by ordeal felt fairer than trusting some corrupt baron or illiterate judge. And once you've built your society around that idea, it's hard to walk it back. Still, there were critics even then. As Roman legal ideas trickled back into Europe through rediscovered texts, more people began to ask, maybe we should use evidence instead of scalding people. The Church, too, had second thoughts. In 1215, at the Fourth Lateran Council, Pope Innocent III officially banned clergy from participating in ordeals. Without priests to bless the water or sanctify the process, the whole system started to collapse, slowly, but not immediately. Ordeals limped along, especially in rural areas, well into the late Middle Ages, In some places, they just reinvented the process using oaths or local rituals instead of literal fire. The idea didn't die, it just shapeshifted. Now you're lying in bed thinking, that's insane. Thank God we don't do that anymore. But then you remember, we still have modern versions of ordeal. Maybe not with cauldrons, but in how we publicly shame people online. Cancel careers without trials, or let public opinion stand in for evidence. Diff. So, yet again, we see a medieval band-aidment to hold things together for a generation become a tradition. No one dared question for centuries. Trial by ordeal, part courtroom, part theater, part fever dream. Proof that sometimes, when you leave justice up to divine intervention, you just get burned. Let's set the scene. It's spring, and things are starting to get weird. You live in a cozy little town in northern Italy. Lately, rumors flow faster than wine. Ships pulling into port with dead crews. Strange swellings in armpits and groin. Entire villages gone silent. A few days later, your neighbor coughs once then twice and they're being carried out by men in hooded robes who won't look anyone in the eye. You don't know it yet, but the Black Death has arrived, and with it comes one of the strangest, most permanent legacies of the medieval world. Quarantine. To be clear, the first quarantines weren't science-driven. People didn't know what germs were. They blamed miasma, bad air, planetary alignments, sign, or demonic cats. But they noticed something important. Sickness followed trade. Ports were the problem. So, in 1347, the city of Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, came up with a temporary solution. Ships from infected areas had to wait outside the city walls for 30 days before anyone could come ashore. Just enough time to see if anyone broke out in boils. The policy was called Trentino, a 30-day hold. It wasn't based on medical evidence, but on medieval logic. Wait, watch, and if people start dying, maybe don't invite them to dinner. That 30 days later became 40, giving us the word quarantino, which evolved into quarantine. What began as desperate guesswork during history's worst pandemic eventually became part of international health law. But in the beginning, totally ad hoc, just a panicked city trying to avoid becoming a ghost town. Here's a quirky twist. The number 40 wasn't random. In medieval theology, 40 had sacred weight. Jesus fasted for 40 days. The Israelites wandered the desert for 40 years. When in doubt, medieval folks slapped a holy number on it and hoped for the best. So while quarantino sounded practical, it was really superstition mixed with city bureaucracy, a very medieval cocktail. Other cities copied Ragusa. Venice set up offshore checkpoints. In Milan, officials went further. They bricked infected families into their homes, literally walled them in. Good luck. No stay-at-home order was taken more seriously. And this is where the supposed temporary fix takes a wild turn. Quarantine, born out of chaos, stuck around, not just because it worked, but because it gave governments a reason to exist. Public health became a thing. Suddenly, cities issued regulations about movement, hygiene, even garbage disposal, not out of care, but because no one wanted to die horribly and rot in the street. Before the plague, civic authority was about taxes and petty wars. After, it gained a new role, protector of bodies. Leaders couldn't just rule, they had to manage disease. and quarantine became their favorite tool. Scholars still debate, did the Black Death cause public health, or just accelerate changes already underway? Some say cities were inching toward sanitation laws. Others argue the plague's trauma forced political evolution. Governments became more modern, organized, obsessed with control, all in the name of survival. You, meanwhile, are just trying to get by. Months have passed since the first deaths. Your street is quieter. No carts. The market's closed. The priest gives sermons from behind a screen. You haven't touched another human in weeks. There's no concept of flattening the curve, but the mood is the same. Stay away. Stay quiet. Maybe you'll live. Over time, quarantine becomes institutionalized. Temporary plague measures turn into permanent offices. Cities hire plague doctors, the ones with beaked masks stuffed with herbs, believing it would purify the air. Spoiler, it didn't. But the idea that society could designate people to manage disease, revolutionary. And this policy didn't just impact Europe. Mediterranean trade spread both disease and ideas. Islamic cities like Cairo and Damascus had advanced medical knowledge and their own isolation systems. Temporary lazaretto quarantine hospitals became permanent structures. Once built, they were rarely torn down. Why would they be? There was always another outbreak. Fast forward centuries, and quarantine becomes international policy. In the 17th and 18th centuries, maritime health codes emerge. Quarantine islands appear. Entire bureaucracies form around health inspection. Then, in the 19th and 20th centuries, the same logic returns with cholera, yellow fever, and yes, the flu. Every pandemic, governments don't invent new systems. They dust off old medieval protocols. In a way, the Black Death did what centuries of preaching couldn't. It made people think collectively. Your health was tied to your neighbors. Disease didn't respect class or wealth. The king could die as fast as the stable boy. So everyone started thinking about prevention, a radical shift in an era more comfortable, reacting with prayer and bloodletting. But, like everything normalized, quarantine had its dark side. In later centuries, isolation became a tool not just for health, but for control. Authorities locked up the poor, the foreign, the inconvenient toll under the banner of public safety. Fear became power. And once you create a structure to monitor and restrict people, someone will always use it beyond its original purpose. So there it is, quarantine, a desperate invention during humanity's darkest hours. Born of fear and ignorance, wrapped in sacred numbers and civic panic. It wasn't supposed to last. It wasn't even supposed to work. But it became one of the most enduring tools in the medieval survival toolkit, and we're still living with its legacy today. Not bad for a policy based on the logic of, let's just wait 40 days and see what happens. Imagine you're the second son of a minor noble in 12th century Burgundy. Your older brother inherits the estate, the castle, the title, and the hunting dogs. You, a horse, a rusty sword, and maybe a bishopric if your family knows the right people. Welcome to the beautiful disaster of primogeniture. Medieval inheritance rule meant to simplify things, but ended up shaping Europe in all the worst and weirdest ways. Primogeniture is the system where the firstborn son inherits everything, not just land or title, but all of it. Earlier Germanic and Celtic traditions often split inheritance among all sons, sometimes even daughters. But that led to fragmented lands, too many rival castles, and roughly one rebellion per generation. So, around the 11th century, lords and kings decided to tidy things up, just give it all to the firstborn. Keep estates intact, reduce power struggles, avoid garden stabbings. Sounds practical, right? It was a temporary fix-and-eat solution to messy succession. It never went away. At first, it helped. Estates stayed large. Castles didn't get split. Armies remained unified. But then everyone realized this rule created a massive surplus of landless, angry, ambitious sons. Thousands of second, third, and fifth-born boys with no prospects, no land, and way too much training in swordsmanship and bad poetry. So what did they do? Joined the church, became wandering knights. Or worse, went rogue. And when the Crusades rolled around, guess who signed up in droves? The landless sons of Europe, itching to carve out kingdoms in the Levant, because Uncle Jeff got the good manor. Quirky fact. This surplus of aristocratic losers directly fueled the knightly class in literature. All those tales of wandering heroes seeking honor and dragons. They're basically rich kids with no inheritance, trying to build a reputation from scratch. Lancelot, definitely a second son. Gawain, maybe a third. These guys weren't just fighting for honor, they were fighting for relevance. And while primogeniture was meant to create stability, it actually concentrated land, power, and privilege generation after generation. Think the 1% today is bad. Try being a 14th century peasant whose great-grandfather farmed the same plot, still owned by the same family, because no one ever divided it. Scholars still bicker. Was primogeniture the best option, or just the one with the fewest civil wars? Some say, without it, Europe might have fractured like the Balkans. Others point out that England and France, both primogeniture nations, still had plenty of rebellions. So maybe the avoid drama argument was just royal fantasy. Let's talk about what it felt like to live under this system. You're the fourth son of a knight. You grow up watching your older brother train with the best tutors while you're told to shut up and pray. He learns politics and falconry. You learn how to count church candles and kneel properly. When your father dies, the estate goes entirely to him. You're expected to find a patron, take holy orders, or marry someone with more land than teeth. It's like your birth order is a permanent job assignment you never applied for, and daughters fared even worse. Most were married off as political pawns or shoved into convents, fuzzed with hefty dowries that drained family coffers. Under primogeniture, women were used to secure property through marriage, not inherit it themselves. It was a system designed to exclude, not share. Here's the irony. The very system meant to simplify. Succession created some of the bloodiest disputes in medieval history. Why? Firstborn sons don't always live long. Have sons gloriously aren't totally incompetent. When the heir dies or fails, the question becomes, who's next? A younger brother? A cousin? The wife's cousin's husband's nephew? Cue succession wars, lots of them. Ever heard of the 100 Years' War? At its core, it kicked off because of a primogeniture dispute. Edward III of England claimed the French throne through his mother's line. The French disagreed. Your property, but with chores. Unlike slaves, they couldn't be sold individually. They came with the land. You were part of the estate, like the well, the barn, or the suspiciously inbred cows. Scholars still argue over how bad serfdom really was. Some point out that serfs weren't completely helpless. They had rights, access to communal lands, and sometimes even courts to appeal to. Others argue those rights were mostly symbolic, and the daily grind was brutal, humiliating, and utterly inescapable. Your whole existence was defined by what you owed your lord: labor days, food, rent, livestock, and the occasional goose sacrifice on St. Bull's Day, okay? Not really the goose part, probably, but make no mistake, the system worked for the people at the top. Lords got dependable labor, the church got dependable tithes, kings got stable populations to tax, and serfs got, well, rashes and existential dread. Imagine being born into that. You're 10 years old, already working the fields, and you ask your father, "Will I ever go to the city?" He laughs, coughs, and shakes his head. The city? That's a week's walk, and we'd have to ask Lord Robert's permission. You've never seen a city. You've never seen a map. The farthest you've traveled is to the next village over for the midsummer pig roast. And then imagine being trapped in this system not because of law, but because of custom. That's what's truly wild. No one had to pass a bill. No king stood up and declared serfdom a forever thing. It just ossified like barnacles on a boat. Everyone went along with it because it had always been that way. Lords got used to the power. Serfs got used to the limits. Even the church told you it was God's will. What's more, serfdom wasn't even uniform. In some regions, especially parts of Eastern Europe, was far more severe and lasted well into the 19th century. In others, like parts of France and the Low Countries, it began to loosen earlier. By the High Middle Ages, some serfs managed to buy their freedom, and cities offered a path out. The old saying went, "Town air makes free." If a serf could live in a town for a year and a day without being caught, they were considered free. So yes, medieval runaways were a real thing. Imagine sneaking out of your lord's manor like it's a heist film. 1 burlap sack, 2 crusts of bread, and a dream. Still, most didn't run. Most couldn't. The system relied on isolation. Few people could read. Travel was dangerous. Even if you wanted to escape, where would you go? And if you were caught, punishments could range from fines to forced labor. You guessed it, being tied even more tightly to the land. The biggest irony? Serfdom was never meant to be permanent. It began as a practical arrangement between desperate people in a fractured world. But no one set an expiration date. And once something gives the powerful power, it rarely gets voluntarily dismantled. Even when things did start to change, thanks to events like the Black Death, which wiped out so many people that labor suddenly became valuable, the system dragged on. Lords tried to pass laws to freeze wages and restrict movement. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was in part about serfdom. Serfs were demanding freedom, wages, rights, and they weren't asking politely. Eventually, serfdom did fade, slowly, unevenly, and mostly because the economics stopped working. But its shadow lingered. The idea that people could be legally stuck where they were born, defined by class, labor, and birth order, that persisted long after the title serf vanished from the scrolls. So the next time you're stuck in traffic or on hold with customer service. Just remember, at least you're not legally bound to a Cabbage Patch for life because of a centuries-old temporary agreement no one remembered to cancel. Let's play a little word game. I say Holy Roman Empire, and you think, what? A vast, shining empire of pious order and Roman-style governance. Maybe something with golden eagles and grand senatorial robes. Yeah, no, the joke that never dies credited to Voltaire, but probably muttered by half of Europe at some point. It was basically the medieval version of your group project partner who shows up halfway through, says they're coordinating, and somehow ends up with their name on the final report. But here's what's wild. It wasn't even supposed to last. The Holy Roman Empire started as a temporary solution to a royal identity crisis. Charlemagne had revived the imperial title in 800 AD to bring legitimacy to his rule, stitch together Europe's fraying seams, and give the Pope a reason to stay on his good side. But Charlemagne died. His grandsons split the territory like a cake at a bitter family reunion, and the whole empire idea sort of collapsed. Then, more than a century later, a guy named Otto I dusted off the imperial crown and said, "Hey, let's try this again." In 962, the Pope crowned him emperor, hoping to recreate the glory days of Rome, but with more bishops and way fewer aqueducts this time. It was meant to be symbolic, a sign of Christian unity in a messy world full of warlords and squabbling kingdoms. It wasn't intended to create a sprawling megastructure that would stagger along for nearly 1,000 years, but it did. And what was the Holy Roman Empire, exactly? A hot, messy, glorious patchwork of duchies, bishoprics, free cities, and weird little principalities like Saxony, Württemberg, and the electorate of the Palatinate. If that sounds like a lot of syllables with very little meaning, that's because it was. Think of the empire as the world's most dysfunctional family reunion. Everyone's technically related. Nobody agrees on who's in charge. And there's always an argument over the inheritance. Here's a quirky bit. The emperor wasn't automatically inherited. He was elected by a group of prince-electors, powerful, secular, and religious leaders. That means the Holy Roman Emperor was kind of like a monarch with a really hostile board of directors. You needed to campaign, kiss rings, bribe people, and still expect betrayal the second you tried to pass taxes. So what kept this sprawling, barely governable entity alive? Two things: prestige and momentum. Being emperor of the Romans still carried weight. It connected you to the Romavan if you ruled from a drafty castle in Saxony with no plumbing. It was a useful title. It sounded cool on treaties. And as long as the emperor didn't try to actually control too much, everyone played along. But let's talk about how hilariously fragile it was. The empire had no permanent capital, no standing army, no real bureaucracy. At times, the emperor couldn't even travel safely through his own territory without negotiating passage. And yet, somehow, this rickety political Frankenstein kept stumbling forward, century after century, because no one had the guts or the power to unplug it. Scholars still debate whether the Holy Roman Empire was a failure, a proto-European union, or just the world's most ambitious real estate scam. Some argue it preserved cultural unity in a fractured time. Others say it slowed progress, blocked centralization, and bred centuries of infighting. Honestly, it was both. It was a mess and a miracle, like a medieval Jenga tower that never quite fell. Imagine you're a merchant in a free imperial city like Nuremberg. You technically live inside the empire, but your city runs itself. You pay taxes to the emperor, sort of, but also to your local council. You mint your own coins. You host fairs that attract people from all over Europe. When the emperor sends orders, you nod politely. It's less imperial authority and more imperial suggestion box. Meanwhile, the church plays puppet master. The Pope loved the empire when emperors were humble and devout. But if they got too confident, boom, excommunication. At least 4 emperors were excommunicated during their reigns, and one was even forced to walk barefoot through the snow to beg the Pope's forgiveness in what might be history's most passive-aggressive apology tour. And yet, through all this chaos, the Holy Roman Empire managed to give birth to some pretty important ideas. Universities thrived under its protection. Local law codes developed. It gave the world Beethoven and Gutenbergen, a truly stunning number of castles per square mile. It also created a model for decentralized rule that centuries later would inspire federalist systems in other parts of the world. But eventually, things fell apart. The Reformation tore through the empire like a theological forest fire. Protestant princes and Catholic bishops turned on each other. Wars erupted. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 basically turned the empire into a collection of sovereign states loosely hanging on to the idea of unity for the sake of tradition and occasional sausage festivals. Still, it technically lasted until 1806, when Napoleon, ever the party crasher, marched through like a wrecking ball and forced Emperor Francis II to dissolve it. After that, the title was gone. No more holy, no more Roman, no more empire. Just 1,000 tiny German states left blinking in the sunlight. But the memory stuck. Even today, echoes of the Holy Roman Empire linger in Germany's federal structure, in Austria's weird obsession with titles, and in the deep historical memory of Europe's uneasy balance between unity and sovereignty. So here it is again. Something that was supposed to be temporary imperial revival to satisfy a pope and secure a throne turns into one of the most absurdly durable political entities in history. The Holy Roman Empire wasn't just a misnamed relic. It was a symbol of how long humans will cling to anything, if it gives them the illusion of order in a world full of chaos. And of course, a crown that shiny was never going to sit idle for long. You're squinting by candlelight in a... But somehow, this mess evolves into something truly unexpected. The university. What began as a short-term patch, train clergy, and fill out church rosters, turns into a cornerstone of civilization, and eventually, Lil Wen a year, industry selling hoodies and meal plans. Let's rewind. In the beginning, education in medieval Europe was sparse, improvised, and strictly for religious purposes. Literacy was almost entirely the church's business. If you wanted to learn anything beyond your catechism, you had 2 options: join a monastery or convince a bishop to let you loiter near the library. Schools were attached to cathedrals and abbeys, and they were practical, designed to produce more priests, not philosophers. The idea of a structured, long-term academic institution wasn't even on the table. This was supposed to be training, not tenure, but demand kept growing. Kings needed literate bureaucrats. Bishops needed more theologians. Law courts, believe it or not. Slowly, the cathedral school model began mutating in places like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. Groups of scholars and students began clustering together. They weren't planning to invent the modern university. They were just trying to keep learning, get jobs, or avoid farm work. But their tiny circles of Latin, logic, and insomnia got formalized. Licenses were issued. Curricula took shape, and boom, by the 12th and 13th centuries, universities were popping up like particularly grumpy mushrooms. Now, here's the quirky part. The early universities weren't places you went to. They were people. The Latin word universitas meant a guild or corporations, specifically a guild of scholars or students. You didn't attend Oxford, the place. You joined Oxford, the people who argue about Aristotle too loudly. These early schools didn't even have buildings. Classes were held in rented rooms, churches, or wherever someone could talk without getting interrupted by livestock. The first majors were theology, law, and medicine. Arts and philosophy came later. But don't picture modern electives here. You weren't deciding between medieval astronomy and introduction to falconry. You were reading Aristotle's categories, parsing word by word Latin commentaries, and sitting through lectures that lasted for hours, sometimes longer. And if you think your professors today are boring, just imagine a man in a robe reading aloud in Latin without punctuation. So how did this temporary fix for a priest shortage become the institutional juggernaut we know today? Well, it got popular, and power loves popularity. Kings and popes saw that educated people could make laws, collect taxes, and write legal documents that didn't look like ransom notes. So they started granting universities charters, protecting their autonomy, even exempting them from local laws. Some universities had their own legal systems and were allowed to self-govern. Imagine failing your final land, then suing your professor in your university's own court. And it wasn't all monks and robes. By the 14th century, universities had become magnets for young men with more ambition than direction. You had boarding houses full of students staying up too late, drinking too much, and occasionally starting brawls with the local townspeople. There were actual town versus gown riots where students and citizens fought in the streets over tavern bills and insulted honor. You think campus drama is a modern thing? Please. These guys invented etonally, with more Latin swearing. There's still scholarly debate over what the first true university was. Some say Bologna, founded in 1088 for its law studies. Others point to Paris, known for theology and its role in shaping the scholastic method. Oxford and Cambridge emerged shortly after and set the tone for the English-speaking world. But what unites them all is this: they weren't meant to last forever. They were formed out of necessity, convenience, and an awkward mix of idealism and power. And yet, here we are. The university model spread across Europe and eventually the world. The system of degrees, bachelor, master, doctorate, comes from this time. So does the lecture model, the academic gown. The idea of disciplines, faculties, and research as a public good, not because it was the best way to learn, but because it was the way that worked well enough to survive. And in the medieval world, works well enough might as well be a gold star. Imagine you're a student at the University of Paris in 1300. You're 17. just walked from your village, carrying a single change of clothes and a parchment notebook. You live in a drafty, rented attic above a butcher shop. You attend lectures from dawn until noon, then spend the rest of your day copying text by hand. There are no dorms, no cafeterias, no health plans, but you're learning logic, theology, grammar, and philosophy. You're preparing to be a priest, or maybe a clerker, if you're lucky, a scholar. The world doesn't seem to care that you're exhausted. It just cares that you can argue like your life depends on it. But don't forget, this whole system wasn't designed for you. It was patched together on the fly, expanded in panic, and institutionalized by accident. It was meant to solve a short-term shortage of literate clergy. Instead, it gave us the blueprint for modern education, complete with tenure tracks, tuition hikes, and the eternal student struggle of what am I even doing with this degree? And the cost? Well, back then it was time, humility, and the possibility of freezing to death before your doctorate. Now, it's student loans, different flavor. Same medieval leftovers. So, the next time you walk past a university's grand, ivy-covered facade, just remember, it started as a monk in a cold room, hunched over a manuscript, hoping someone would copy it before the ink froze. A temporary fix, a holy hack, a centuries-old workaround that we still use today, just with more coffee and slightly fewer riots. You're in a monastery somewhere deep in the German countryside. It's early March, the wind still bites through the stone walls, and you've been fasting for so long that your ribs feel like a built-in xylophone. It's Lenten as a monk. You're committed. No meat, no dairy, no eggs. You're living off weak vegetable broth and black bread hard, enough to bludgeon a heretic. But the brothers in your order, clever as ever, have a plan. They're brewing a new kind of drink, thick, hearty, dark, something that might technically be liquid, but also kind of counts as food. It's beer, and not just any beer, but Lenten beer, a spiritual loophole that turned into one of Europe's longest-lasting, most beloved cultural fixtures. Let's be clear. Beer wasn't invented. In the Middle Ages, humans have been fermenting stuff since we figured out that wet grain left in the sun gets weird and then fun. But what medieval monks did, what they accidentally immortalized, transform beer from a common everyday drink into a regulated, perfected, borderline sacred beverage. And it all started because of a temporary seasonal fast and a need for, let's say, calorically enhanced holiness during Lent. Food restrictions were intense. Monks needed sustenance, but also wanted to avoid breaking the rules. So they brewed a stronger, thicker beer called Doppelbock by later generations that was basically bread in a glass. It was dense, rich, malty, and loaded with calories. Drinking it wasn't technically eating, so it became the perfect Lenten loophole. It filled your belly without violating your vow. Clever, extremely, holy, questionable, delicious, absolutely. And here's your quirky fact. According to legend, monks believed that if the beer tasted too good, it might be spiritually suspicious. So, before making it a staple of their Lent diet, they reportedly sent a barrel of the stuff to the Pope in Rome for approval. But by the time it got there, after weeks sloshing in the sun across the Alps, it had gone sour. The Pope tasted the bitter sludge and was like, well, if this is what they're drinking, it's basically punishment, proved. And that's how monastic beer got the blessing of the papacy. at least according to the story. Whether that tale is true or just beer-fueled folklore is still up for debate. But what's not in doubt is how widespread and enduring this monk-brewed beer became. What started as a seasonal workaround turned into a full-time industry. Monasteries became some of the best brewers in Europe-priming recipes, innovating with hops, improving sanitation, and, of course, drinking the profits. Over time, their beer became a key source of income. Monks sold it to travelers, villages, even other clergy. They built beer halls and storage cellars. Some monasteries grew rich not from donations or relics, but from their brewery taps. Imagine being a weary pilgrim in the 14th century. You stop at a Benedictine abbey for shelter. You expect a bed of straw and a crust of bread, but instead, you're handed a foaming mug of thick, dark beer, served by a serene man in a robe who probably spent the morning chanting psalms and the afternoon perfecting his malt blend. It's one of those surreal, only in the Middle Ages moments. Religion and alcohol joining hands under the guise of virtue. Of course, the rest of society caught on. By the late medieval period, beer had evolved from a humble peasant drink into a refined beverage with social and regional significance. Different towns had their own recipes. Guilds were formed. Laws were written. And guess what? A lot of this standardization traces back to the monks who had the resources, the time, and the scribal talent to write down and preserve their brewing methods. There's still debate among historians over how much these monastic brewing traditions shaped modern beer versus how much credit belongs to secular brewers who came later. But the records are clear. Medieval monasteries, especially in places like Bavaria and Flanders, were crucial to the development of beer as both. And then there's the Reinheitsgebot, the famous German beer purity law passed in 1516. While technically post-medieval, it's deeply rooted in those earlier monastic traditions. It stated that beer could only be made from 3 ingredients: water, barley, and hops. Yeast wasn't included because no one understood how fermentation actually worked. They just assumed it happened if you prayed hard enough. The goal: to protect beer quality and avoid weird additives like soot, wood bark, or disturbingly chicken feathers. And while the Reinheitsgebot gets the spotlight, the groundwork was laid centuries earlier by monks, obsessing over their Lent-friendly brews. Even after the monastic brewing monopoly began to wane thanks to Reformation, iconoclasm, and good old-fashioned secular capitalism, many monastic breweries survived. Some are still operational today. In fact, some of the best beer in the world comes from Trappist monasteries brewed using centuries-old recipes and sold to fund charitable work. So yes, in a way, buying a Belgian triple is doing God's work. Sort of. But the real legacy, the idea that beer could be more than just a drink, that it could be an act of devotion, a craft, a trade, even a way to bend the rules without technically breaking them, all because a group of starving monks committed to their fast decided going to let hunger ruin their holiness or their day. So next time you're sipping a cold one, think of the medieval monastery where someone squinted into a bubbling cauldron, scratched their chin, and thought, well, if we can't eat, maybe we can drink our way through this season. A temporary loophole turned eternal tradition. Fermented through time, faith, and just a little bit of rebellion. You're on horseback, armor creaking, sunlight glinting off your polished helmet hand. The crowd gathered along the muddy road erupts into cheers as you ride past. You nod regally, because of course you do. And your horse, who has no clue what's going on, prances like he's just invented chivalry. You're a knight. And while your job was supposed to be temporary, just another class of hired muscle in a violent, chaotic world, you've somehow become the icon of the entire Middle Ages. All steel, honor, and swagger. Except, let's be honest, most knights were more bouncer than noble. The idea of knighthood started out practicula, patch on a torn system of defense, and ended up tangled in myth, poetry, and really inconveniently placed lances. Knighthood began as a solution. After the collapse of Rome and endless waves of invasions, Vikings from the north, Magyars from the east, Saracens from the south, lords needed reliable fighters to protect their lands. So they created a class of mounted warriors, tough, loyal, hopefully, and well-equipped. It wasn't some sacred order at first. It was a job. You swore to defend your lord, got a horse, a sword, and enough chainmail to drown in. Boom. It was transactional, not transcendent. These guys were paid sometimes in land, sometimes in loot. They were walking contracts with swords, the code of chivalry. That came later. At first, if you were strong, rich enough to afford armor, and ready to bash skulls on command, congratulations, you were knight material. It didn't matter if you could read or knew which fork to use at dinner. You didn't even need a last name. But then, as with most things in the Middle Ages, image overtook function. By the 12th century, knighthood had started to evolve, rather inflate. The church realized these well-armed horsemen were a bit of a problem. Knights were prone to robbing monasteries, extorting peasants, and fighting each other for fun. So the church tried to rein them in by inventing ideals. Enter the peace of God and truce of God movements, which forbade knights from attacking clergy, peasants, or fighting on Sundays. Did it work? Not really. But it planted the seed of a different idea. Maybe knights should be noble in behavior, not just birth. Add in a few troubadours, a handful of poets, and some courtly love drama, and suddenly the knight becomes a romantic figure. Not just a thug on a horse, but a hero. Think Lancelot, Gawain, Roland. They weren't real, but boy, did people want to believe in them? Knights were now supposed to defend the weak, uphold justice, and crucially pine endlessly for unattainable noblewomen while writing awkward poems about their eyes. Quirky fact. Most of the knights romanticized in literature were dead by the time their stories were told. The Song of Roland, for example, was written more than 2 centuries after the actual Battle of Roncesvalles Pass. It's like if someone turned your slightly cranky uncle into a Marvel superhero because he once stood up to a parking meter. Historians still argue about whether chivalry was ever actually real. Some see it as a sincere effort to elevate violent men into moral agents. Others think it was just propaganda way to make nobility look classy while they kept stomping on the poor. The truth, as usual, is somewhere in between. Some knights did strive to live by the code. Others just wore the title and used it as a license to plunder with flair. But here's the thing. Even though knighthood was born as a temporary military fix, somewhere between a mercenary and a bodyguard, stuck hard, it became the social ideal for centuries. Kings started knightly orders, like the Order of the Garter in England, or the Teutonic Knights in Germany. These weren't just about combat. They were status clubs, blending religion, pageantry, and raw political power. Getting knighted became a symbol of honor, not just a qualification for stabbing. And while the battlefield changed, longbows, pikes, and gunpowder, the image of the knight refused to die, even as heavy cavalry started losing its edge in actual warfare. Knights were still being created and celebrated. It didn't matter that their military role was shrinking. What mattered was the myth. Nobles weren't giving up the title just because it was outdated. Are you kidding? Being a knight came with prestige, land, and the right to wear ridiculous feathers on your helmet without anyone laughing. Imagine, you're a 15th century squire polishing your master's armor, dreaming of the day you'll be dubbed a knight. You've read the Arthurian romances. You know the rules of chivalry. And you honestly believe that a noble heart and a well-placed sword strike can change the world. Meanwhile, your master is across the hall yelling at a peasant for not paying rent on time and trying to marry off his daughter for a better dowry. The gap between ideal and reality is wide enough to ride a warhorse through. Still, the dream persisted. Knighthood bled into national identity. Even today, people get knighted in modern countries, minus the jousting, unfortunately. So Paul McCartney isn't riding into battle, but he's carrying the same honorary tradition that started as a military quick fix. Heck, even modern video games, movies, and fantasy novels are still obsessed with knights clanking around in armor, rescuing maidens, battling dragons, and making monologues about justice. The image of the knight has outlived its purpose by centuries, and here's the ultimate irony. The original knights, the real ones, would barely recognize the version of themselves that lives in our stories. They weren't gallant warriors quoting poetry by moonlight. They were brutal, flawed, power-hungry opportunists who happened to look cool on horseback. But the myth we built around them that stuck because we love symbols. We love ideals. And nothing sells the Middle Ages quite like a shiny suit of armor and a man pledging loyalty to a crown, a cause, or a particularly attractive duchess. Knighthood was never meant to become a cultural archetype. It was a band-aid slapped on a bleeding society. But like so many other medieval stopgaps, it grew legs, picked up a sword, and charged its way into eternity. Grew legs, picked up a sword, and charged its way into eternity. You're standing in the village square, trying to figure out why your neighbor Agnes is being dragged away in chains. She's always been a bit odd, talks to cats, grows weird herbs, and once predicted the weather a little too accurately. But you've known her your whole life. Now she's being accused of consorting with demons. The priest is citing a passage from a newly popular book, and the crowd is nodding along even though half of them owe her money. What you're witnessing isn't just a public humiliation. It's part of a larger trend that was supposed to be short-lived, a moral cleanup effort gone off the rails. Welcome to the strange, smoldering phenomenon of witch hunts, a medieval panic that was never supposed to last but somehow stuck around for hundreds of years and still hasn't completely left us. At first, belief in witchcraft during the Middle Ages wasn't even all that organized. The early church actually downplayed fears about witches, calling them pagan nonsense. St. Augustine, for example, argued that believing in magical powers outside of God's influence was itself heretical. The official position: witches aren't real and worrying about them makes you a bad Christian, which, all things considered, is kind of progressive. But then the social mood shifted. Europe had seen the Black Death, endless wars, political instability, and more heresies than anyone could track. People needed someone to blame. Slowly, an idea took root that some people, usually women, always outsiders, were making secret pacts with the devil. Not just practicing folk healing or growing herbs, but literally flying to nighttime meetings, kissing demons, and poisoning wells. This wasn't about isolated incidents anymore. It was becoming a full-blown conspiracy theory. Enter the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches, published in 1487 by Heinrich Kramer, a Dominican inquisitor, who may or may not have been rejected by every respectable academic circle in Europe. The book was supposed to be a guide for, but instead of offering reasoned guidance, it poured gasoline on an already growing fire. Quirky fact: the Malleus was rejected by the Church when first published. The theology was shaky, the obsession with sexual deviancy intense, and the authorship dubious. But somehow, it got reprinted again and again until it became the go-to manual for hunting witches. The printing press had just arrived, and Kramer's paranoid fever dream went viral in the worst way. Scholars still debate why the witch craze really took off. Some argue it was economic blame the poor when times are hard. Others say it was misogynistic backlash in a world where women were gaining a sliver of influence, especially as midwives and herbalists. Others see it as a power grab by church authorities or secular courts. It was probably all of these things, a stew of anxiety, patriarchy, ignorance, and fear simmering in the cauldron of late medieval Europe, while the peak of the witch hunts came later in the 16th and 17th centuries. The groundwork was laid in the Middle Ages, the belief that witchcraft was not only real but organized, that a hidden network of evil was secretly eroding Christian society, took hold and never really let go. What began as a fringe fear metastasized into international policy. Whole villages were torn apart by accusations. Trials were held with zero evidence. Torture was routine. Confessions were extracted from people who hadn't slept in days. It became a systema machine that couldn't stop itself. Imagine being a woman living alone in a small town. You're unmarried. You know how to make tinctures from plants. Maybe you've had a few run-ins with the reeve over property lines. Now your cow dies mysteriously, or someone's child falls ill. Suddenly, you're under suspicion. You can't prove you didn't curse anyone. And the harder you deny it, the more suspicious you look. It's a trap. There's no way out because innocence isn't the point. Fear is . And here's where the temporary part really bites. Witch hunts weren't supposed to be policy. They were meant to be emergency actions in rare cases. But once the machinery was built, laws passed, courts trained, towns terrified to never shut down, it got funded, codified, institutionalized. Entire careers were built on it. People became professional witch hunters. The fear was profitable, even in places that resisted, like certain parts of Spain. Oddly enough, there were still outbreaks. And when the Protestant Reformation rolled in, the paranoia only grew. Now, it wasn't just witches, was Catholic witches or Protestant witches, depending on who you asked. It wasn't just about the devil. It was about the other, and once a society labeled someone as the other, it's a short walk to the stake. Eventually, the trials began to slow. By the late 17th century, most of Europe had moved on, though it took until the 18th century for some regions to officially stop executing witches. But even after the smoke cleared, the legacy remained. Witch hunts became the go-to metaphor for mass hysteria, for scapegoating, for the violence we commit when we're desperate for answers. And that's the uncomfortable truth. Witch hunts weren't just a medieval thing. They weren't just about superstition or religious mania. They were about fear being weaponized by institutions, by neighbors, by people who wanted control. The system was supposed to be short-lived, a moral mop-up, a way to handle the bad apples, but it lasted for centuries. And in some ways, it never really ended. Think about how we still talk about witch hunts today in politics, in media, in courts of public opinion. It's become shorthand for a very old pattern. Panic leads to accusation. Accusation leads to punishment. And punishment never actually fixes the problem. It just feeds the fear. So next time you hear someone casually drop the phrase, remember where it came from. Not a spooky bedtime story, but a moment in history when temporary fear turned into permanent terror, and neighbors stopped asking questions and started lighting torches. You're squinting at a battlefield, the dust thick in the air. Your helmet's sliding slightly sideways because it was made for your older brother, and you can barely tell who's who. The banners are flapping, but everyone's wearing the same muddy armor. It's chaos. Then, across the field, you spot a brilliant splash of red and gold, a lion on a shield, and you think, finally, someone to stab. That right there is the origin story of heraldry, the medieval attempt to solve the age-old problem of battlefield confusion by turning every noble family into its own walking logo. And like so many things in this series, it was never supposed to become permanent. It was a quick, practical fix that got so entrenched, people started using it on their tombstones. Stationary and personalized GOBLETS. Heraldrithos crests, coats of arms, and gloriously overcomplicated designs began in the 12th century as visual shorthand. Picture a battlefield without uniforms, radios, or overhead maps, just armored men whacking each other and hoping they don't accidentally kill a cousin. You needed a way to tell friend from foe at a glance, so knights started painting distinctive patterns and symbols on their shields and surcoats, not for fashion, not for flair, just function. These early designs were basic: stripes, crosses, a few animals. But once lords realized they could personalize their armor and still be taken seriously in battle, things got artistic. Enter the lions, griffins, bears, fleurs, and increasingly baroque arrangements of stars, swords, and dismembered limbs. Colors got symbolic. Shapes meant something. A blue background with a silver chevron. That's House blah blah from West Nowhere. The guy with a green boar on a gold field. Definitely someone you insulted at a feast once. And because medieval people never met a system they couldn't overcome, heraldry quickly turned into a full-blown science, or, technically, Heraldic law. Special officers called heralds were appointed to keep track of who was using what design. They worked like brand managers, mixed with archivists and part-time referees. Heralds attended tournaments and battles, made lists, and ensured no two knights rocked the same eagle-dragon combo without permission. Think of them as the medieval version of copyright enforcement, only with more feathers and fewer sandesist letters. Quirky fact: heraldry even had its own weird vocabulary. You couldn't just say red background with a lion. You had to say a lion rampant. Black was sable, white was argent, gold was orand. The positioning of each creature had a name: rampant, passant, couchant, regardant, each describing whether the animal was standing, lying down, looking backward, or doing its taxes. The whole thing reads like someone had a stroke while trying to describe a zoo through a stained glass window. What started as a battlefield necessity eventually migrated into the rest of medieval life. Knights used their heraldry on seals, banners, clothing, and even dinnerware. Castles were carved with coats of arms. Churches displayed family crests in stained glass. Tombstones bore the family symbols, so even in death, you could be identified by your color scheme. And don't get started on tournaments. What was once practice for battle became the Super Bowl of heraldic display. Knights wore full coats emblazoned with their arms, their squires carried flags, and their horses wore matching outfits like it was medieval fashion week. Here's where it really gets sticky. Heraldry became hereditary. Your coat of arms was passed down like a title or an estate. Over time, entire families, then lineages, then dynasties, were defined by these designs. They became legal identifiers, proof of legitimacy and noble birth. If someone forged your arms or claimed a design too close to yours, it was grounds for a lawsuit or a duel. Sometimes both. Scholars still argue about how much heraldry actually influenced class structure. Some say it was a way to maintain noble exclusivity, visual proof that you belonged to the ruling club. Others think it was more flexible, with merchants and commoners eventually creating their own pseudo-heraldry for status or business branding. Either way, heraldry wasn't just art, it was identity, not just for individuals, but for entire regions and institutions. Imagine you're a lesser noble in 14th century England. Your family's crest is a blue shield with 3 silver fishnot, flashy but respectable. You put it on your armor, your tent, your wax seal. Then one day, you hear that some upstart knight from Cornwall is riding around with your fish, except they're golden and upside down. You rage. You ride to London. You file a complaint with the College of Arms, which actually exists, and takes this stuff very seriously. Welcome to the ridiculous seriousness of medieval branding. But of course, like everything else in this saga, heraldry outlasted its original purpose. By the time gunpowder warfare took over and full body armor became obsolete, coats of arms weren't needed on the battlefield anymore. You didn't need to know who was swinging what sword when everyone was just shooting each other from behind earthworks. And yet, heraldry didn't die. It shifted. It became decorative, symbolic, and even more enshrined in ceremony. Governments adopted coats of arms. Cities designed them. Guilds created their own. Even today, entire countries have heraldic seals. Schools, universities, sports teams, and corporations still echo the old logic. Here's a visual design that tells you who we are and what we stand for. We just call it logo design now. And let's not forget family crests. Even if you've never seen yours, or if you're 99% sure it was made up by a souvenir shop in Dublin, you've probably encountered the idea. Some people still hang them on walls, print them on reunion t-shirts, or get them tattooed like some ancestral BARCODE. The idea that we heraldry, a temporary battlefield solution turned social institution turned legacy aesthetic. It wasn't supposed to last longer than the next skirmish. But then people saw their family griffin in stained glass and thought, yeah, that's me forever. It's a chilly morning in 13th century Florence, and you've just witnessed the most thrilling event of the week. A local merchant swearing in front of a priest and 2 witnesses that he really, truly did sell 10 bolts of cloth to that fishmonger across the street. No paper, no receipt, just dramatic hand gestures, maybe a handshake, and a bunch of people nodding solemnly. Welcome to the medieval notary's world, a role that began as a humble, temporary recorder of contracts, but somehow evolved into a sprawling, paper-choked bureaucracy that has haunted us ever since. The notary's job was originally straightforward. Write stuff down. That's it. In a society where most people were illiterate and memory was about as reliable as medieval plumbing, someone had to officially document agreements, especially ones involving land, marriage, money, or death. So cities began appointing notaries to serve as legal witnesses and scribes, mostly to prevent every business deal from turning into a shouting match or a duel involving goats. But this wasn't just scribbling. Notaries had authority. Their documents carried legal weight. Once a notary signed and sealed a deed, it was as close to law as you were going to get without dragging the Pope into it. And because medieval people were obsessed with ritual and record-keeping, notaries started showing up everywhere at weddings, funerals, courtrooms, even livestock transactions. You couldn't sell a cow or donate land to a monastery without a notary sniffing around with ink-stained fingers and a wax stamp. Quirky fact. Medieval notaries had their own personal emblems or marks, basically proto-signatures they used to authenticate documents. Some got really fancy squiggles, monograms, symbols with obscure meanings. It was half signature, half branding. In a way, they were the first bureaucrats with a logo. And this role wasn't just limited to monks or city clerks. By the 12th century, notaries were becoming part of a growing professional class, educated, trained, and often well-connected in places like Italy. Being a notary became a path to power, one of the few ways a literate commoner could rise in prestige without being born into nobility or joining the church. Some notaries became so influential they ran entire cities. Others managed vast archives or traveled with merchant guilds, chronicling trades and treaties like human filing cabinets. Now, here's where things snowballed. What was supposed to be a simple, utilitarian function, write this down, seal it, move on, began to expand. Suddenly, everything needed to be documented. Notaries started drafting contracts for things no one used to care about: loan terms, dowries, apprenticeship deals, promises to repay debts in pigs. And as literacy spread and paper became slightly more available, the role of the notary grew in proportion to society's complexity. More trade, more disputes meant more need for documentation. Imagine you're a 14th century blacksmith who wants to take on an apprentice. You can't just shake hands and hand over a hammer anymore. You need a notarized contract outlining how many years the boy will train, who provides his meals, and what happens if he burns his foot off with molten iron. And you can bet the notary will charge you a fee and ask for your full legal name, your mother's maiden name, and possibly your shoe size, all for a deal that would once been settled with 2 nods and a spit-shake. This explosion of paperwork led to something historians still debate. Did the rise of notaries contribute to the modern legal state? Some say yes, by creating written records. Notaries laid the groundwork for legal standardization, accountability, and governance based on documents instead of memory or muscle. Others argue notaries simply grew with the system, rather than shaping it, riding the wave of urbanization and trade like bureaucratic barnacles. Either way, the result was the same. Documents became everything. In medieval Europe, if it wasn't written down, sealed, and notarized, it might as well not have happened. And once people got used to that, there was no going back. Notaries became as indispensable as bakers or blacksmiths, sect instead of bread or tools. They provided legitimacy. The role also got tangled up with the church because many early notaries were clerics. The language of documentation was often drenched in Latin, religious flourishes, and moral overtones. Even a mundane contract to rent a vineyard for 3 seasons might begin with "in the name of God, Amen," and include blessings for all parties. Writing in this world wasn't just administrative, it was sacred. And over time, as empires rose, fell, and shuffled borders, the notary's job stayed the same: record the chaos, one scroll at a time. It was the notaries who preserved treaties, tallied taxes, and ensured that when a lord died, his estate wasn't claimed by 20 angry cousins with swords and no proof. Today, we still have notarizos, solemn, pen-wielding souls who witness signatures, affix seals, and prevent legal disasters with a single stamp. You probably don't think of them as medieval relics, but they are. Their job, though modernized, is a direct descendant of that early stopgap solution to illiteracy, dishonesty, and the complete lack of digital backups. So next time you're at a notary's desk, staring at a stack of forms and wondering why you can't just email a PDF, remember, you're taking part in a tradition nearly 1,000 years old, a role born of chaos, necessity, and the human need to say, yes, this really happened, and here's my official squiggle to prove it. Notaries weren't supposed to last. They were a workaround. But like every good medieval workaround, they got cozy, built an office, and stayed forever. It's a rainy afternoon in 14th century Ghent, and you're a 22-year-old weaver's apprentice who's finally been accepted into the local guild. The other members give you a gruff nod. The guildmaster presents you with your official shears. There's a mildly undercooked roast to celebrate. You're thrilled. You've made it to now have job security, social respect, and access to secret meetings that mostly involve arguing about thread tension. You don't realize is that you've just joined one of the most deeply embedded institutions in medieval society, one that started as a flexible, temporary labor agreement and somehow turned into a rigid power structure that controlled everything from wages to who could make buttons. At its core, a medieval guild was meant to be helpful, a safety net, a collective. Artisans and merchants needed a way to protect their trades, train newcomers, and avoid getting ripped off by shady clients or imported goods. So they banded together, agreeing on quality standards, prices, and fair practices. They helped sick members, paid for funerals, and even threw the occasional feast. It was part union, part social club, part economic cartel, the original idea. Temporary cooperation between equals, but very quickly that temporary turned into tyrannical. Guilds evolved into gatekeepers. If you weren't a guild member, good luck practicing your craft. If you didn't go through the full apprenticeship process, pass your journeyman trial, and create a masterpiece, yes, that's where the word comes from. You couldn't set up shop. It didn't matter if you were the most talented cobbler in the county. If you weren't approved, you were out. And heaven help you if you tried to sell your goods in someone else's town. Guilds were notoriously territorial. Some cities even posted armed guards at market gates to keep out foreign products, sometimes from only a village or two away. Quirky fact: guilds had elaborate oaths, rituals, and secret handshakes. Okay, maybe not full-on Masonic handshakes, but close. Many swore loyalty over relics, held meetings in candlelit halls, and had coded ways of identifying fellow members. Some even had patron saints, official banners, and matching robes for festivals. You didn't just join a workplace, you joined a tribe. Historians still debate whether guilds were more helpful or harmful. Some argue they upheld quality, protected workers, and created pride and community. Others claim they were closed shops that stifled innovation, raised prices, and froze out competition. The truth, like everything medieval, is probably somewhere in the middle. In some places, guilds were lifelines. In others, they were just another way the powerful kept power. What we know for sure is that guilds had enormous influence. In many cities, they weren't just economic players, they were political ones. Guild leaders often sat on city councils, controlled voting rights, and even chose mayors in Florence. For example, the entire government was dominated by the Artitha guilds. If you were part of the Wool Guild, the Banking Guild, or even the notoriously cranky Judges Guild, you had a voice in how the city was run. And that meant if you weren't in a guild, say, a woman, a Jew, a foreigner, or just a poor craftsman, you were effectively locked out of civic life. Now imagine you're a female potter trying to set up your own kiln in 14th century London. You're talented. Your glazes are stunning. You're reasonably sure your competitors are just jealous, but none of that matters. The Pottery Guild doesn't admit women. If you sell your wares, you risk fines, harassment, or worse. You try to join through your husband, also a potter, but he dies before you qualify. Now, despite your skill, you're illegal. The guild system, originally meant to lift workers up, has left you behind, and the problem only got worse. By the late Middle Ages, some guilds had become almost comically rigid. Innovation was suspect, and efficiency was treason. Change was heresy. If you figured out how to make twice as many shoes in half the time, better keep that to yourself. Be prepared to be strongly discouraged by your peers. And yet, despite all their flaws, guilds worked. People respected them. They built hospitals, funded cathedrals, sponsored festivals, and created social stability in a time when most institutions were held together by duct tape and divine hope. They turned chaotic city economies into relatively organized systems. You knew what you were getting from a butcher's guild shop. You knew a guild-approved blacksmith wasn't going to shoe your horse sideways. The system gave consumers confidence and gave workers protection, up to a point. But like so many medieval inventions, guilds eventually outlived their usefulness. As trade expanded, cities grew, and capitalism got its greasy fingers into everything. Guilds began to look more like obstacles than organizers. The rise of mercantilism and free markets in the early modern period put pressure on these closed systems. Reformers complained that guilds were too exclusive, too slow, too obsessed with outdated rules. Monarchs, seeing an opportunity, started to erode their independence. By the 18th and 19th centuries, guilds across Europe were being abolished or neutered, replaced by modern corporations, labor laws, and open competition. And yet their ghosts remain. Think of professional associations today: lawyers, doctors, electricians, architects. They all have licensing boards, codes of ethics, and credentialing systems. If you've ever been told you need certification to do a job you're already good at, you've met the guilds, great-grandchildren. Unions. Also, guild descendants. Trade shows, guild fairs with better lighting, your LinkedIn endorsements, a digital version of guild reputation. We're still playing the same game, just with fewer meat pies. So the next time someone complains about bureaucracy, exclusivity, or paying dues just to hang a sign over their shop, remember, guilds started as temporary alliances of workers trying to survive in a brutal world. But they grew roots, built halls, wrote rules, and by the time anyone realized, they weren't temporary anymore. They were too big to tear down. A labor fix became a social machine, and it ran for centuries on nothing but pride, paranoia, and paperwork. Picture this: you're a 13th century merchant from York, and you've just arrived in Venice after surviving a 3-month journey involving 4 bribes, 2 bandit attacks, and a suspicious chicken stew you now deeply regret. You're here on business trading wool for spices, but there's a problem. You don't want to carry actual gold or silver back through the Alps because, well, you enjoy being alive. And besides, coins are heavy, so you walk into the local office of a money changer, hand over your cash, and in return, you get a piece of paper signed, sealed, and completely useless unless someone else agrees to honor it. Congratulations, you've just used the medieval version of an ATM, and unknowingly, you've become part of a temporary travel solution that would eventually evolve into the modern banking system. Originally, the church wasn't thrilled about any of this. In fact, lending money with interest usury was considered a sin. Money was meant to be earned through labor, not by sitting around waiting for it to multiply like rabbits. But as trade networks grew and long-distance business became common, people needed a way to move funds without strapping a chest of coins to the back of a mule. Enter the money changers, the financiers, and eventually the merchant bankers. Their job: make your money travel safely. At first, they just exchanged currencies, Florentine florins for Flemish groats, say, but then they got clever. They started issuing promissory notes, managing deposits, and offering short-term loans, all perfectly temporary until they weren't. Quirky fact: these early banks often operated inside churches. Literally, merchants met money changers near altars and chapels because it was believed no one would dare lie, cheat, or steal in front of God. Spoiler: they absolutely did, but still. For centuries, sacred spaces doubled as financial hubs. It was like combining your local credit union with Sunday Masonry, with more incense and less fee. Italy became ground zero for this financial revolution. Cities like Florence, Siena, and Genoa weren't just centers of art. Families like the Bardi, Peruzzi, and later the Medici turned what started as casual bookkeeping into full-blown international finance. They created bills of exchange, letting merchants deposit money in one city and withdraw it in another. These were early versions of checks, customized IOUs that fueled the medieval economy like blood through veins. And the genius of it: it all looked temporary. These were one-off contracts, one-time deals, short-term fixes to help merchants avoid robbery or currency confusion. But these fixes required trust, then structured, then rules, then inevitably institutions, and soon what had been simple convenience turned into complex networks of financial power, ones that rivaled kings. Scholars still debate whether medieval banking caused the shift toward capitalism or simply responded to it. Some argue that the rise of credit, interest, and speculative investment laid the foundation for modern economic systems. Others point out that medieval bankers were just following the needs of traders and didn't exactly invent financial ambition. But either way, the impact is undeniable. Those little handwritten notes exchanged in the back of cathedrals eventually led to central banking, international credit, and everything you both love and hate about finance today. And it wasn't just merchants who noticed. Kings and popes started turning to bankers for loans. Need to fund a war. Call the Bardi, planning a crusade. Maybe the Templars can float you some coin. The irony was thick. Institutions that once banned interest were now borrowing like college freshmen with a new credit card, and the bankers, for their part, weren't just counting coins anymore. They were influencing politics, funding campaigns, and pulling strings behind the scenes. Medieval bankers weren't just moneymen. They were kingmakers. You're not a merchant. You just want to reach the shrine without losing your savings to roadside thieves. So, you deposit your silver with a banker in London, get a written note, and weeks later exchange that note for local currency in France or Spain. You've just used a medieval letter of credit. You don't know it, but you've participated in a system that would later birth credit cards, digital banking, and indirectly, that annoying 3-day delay when your online transfer processes. It's worth noting, too, that the Templars, yes, those sword-wielding warrior monks, were also early pioneers of banking. While crusading was their public job, their side hustle was managing money. Pilgrims deposited funds with them in Europe and withdrew it in the Holy Land using coded slips only Templars could decipher. The Order of the Temple was essentially the medieval world's most heavily armored bank. But like many things born in the Middle Ages, medieval banking had its flaws. Entire banking families could collapse if one royal client defaulted. Edward III famously stiffed the Bardi and Peruzzi, plunging Florence into economic turmoil. Regulations were patchy. Fraud was common. Paperwork, if it existed, was often vague and easily forged. But despite all this, the system survived. It adapted, it expanded, and here's the thing: it was never designed to last. These financial tools were supposed to be workarounds, a way to solve a problem in a difficult, dangerous world. No one in the 1200s sat down and said, "Let's create a global economy based on credit and interest-bearing capital." But that's exactly what happened. And now, 8 centuries later, we're still living in that world. Today's financial institutions, with their skyscrapers and stock tickers, are built on medieval scaffolding. Your ability to swipe a card, send a wire transfer, or invest in crypto with your phone, all of it traces back to the moment when a nervous merchant handed over his coins and took a leap of faith in a promise written on parchment. So, the next time you tap your card and see processing, think of that guy in 13th century Florence holding a wax-sealed note, praying that the banker on the other end is still in business, still honest. Temporary systems, it turns out, make great foundations, especially when nobody ever calls them temporary again. The sun's barely up over the rooftops of medieval Paris, and already the air smells like soot, baking bread, and the faint tang of something definitely dead in the street. You're making your way through narrow, cobbled lanes, past wooden houses that lean like they're whispering secrets to each other, when suddenly you hear the low, rhythmic chant of prayers echoing off stone. You follow the sound to a modest building tucked between a butcher and a bookseller. Inside, a group of ordinary citizens kneel in rows, dressed in rough wool and patched cloaks. No monks, no priests, just neighbors praying together. You've stumbled into one of the laic confraternity's religious clubs for regular people. They were never meant to be permanent institutions, just small, local acts of devotion. But somehow these little groups of pious townsfolk ended up shaping cities, funding hospitals, influencing politics, and leaving behind a legacy that still lingers in everything from non-profit boards to parish bake sales. The word confraternity comes from the Latin confrater, meaning brothers together. It was originally just a label for informal gatherings of lay people who met for prayer, charity, or good, old-fashioned guilt. Most of the time, they weren't trying to be they just wanted to pray with like-minded folks. It was grassroots religions, simple, voluntary, and deeply local. And like a lot of medieval fixes, it started small and spiraled completely out of control. Here's the quirky bit. Many confraternities began with nothing more than a feast day, a miracle rumor, or a collective midlife crisis. A group of merchants might band together to venerate the Virgin Mary. A guild could adopt a patron saint and create a ritual calendar of processions and charitable acts. A widow might sponsor a chapel or soup kitchen and recruit others to join her cause. It wasn't centralized. It wasn't planned. It was medieval crowdsourcing for the soul. But quickly, these groups grew in power and organization. They developed statutes and offices, collected dues, built headquarters, and enforced codes of conduct. In some cities, being part of a confraternity wasn't just a spiritual choice, it was expected. If you were anyone, you belonged to one, sometimes two, maybe three if you were really into candles and confession. And they didn't just pray. They did stuff. They ran hospitals, gave alms, buried the dead, educated poor children, and in some cases basically operated as parallel governments. Imagine you're a shoemaker in 15th century Milan. You work hard, scrape by, and join the local confraternity of St. Crispin, patron of cobblers. Every Thursday, you attend their prayer meetings. Every winter, you help distribute shoes to the poor. When someone dies, you all attend the funeral, walking in procession with candles and singing dirges that you only half remember that you'll attend to. It's exhausting, but it means that when you die, you'll have someone to bury you properly and pray for your soul. That's not nothing in a world where being forgotten is worse than death. What began as a temporary patch or way to offer spiritual and social support outside the rigid structures of church and state, an entire subculture. Confraternities built their own chapels, hired their own priests, and sometimes even commissioned art and architecture. If you've ever seen a Renaissance-era church with oddly specific stained glass of, say, 5 guys handing out bread while kneeling before an obscure saint that was probably paid for by a confraternity with a decent savings account. But like most medieval institutions, these pious clubs had a dark side. Some became exclusive, cliquish, or downright elitist. Others turned into political tools, especially in cities like Florence or Venice, where religious devotion and civic power liked to dance a complicated tango. If you were in the wrong confraternity, you might be excluded from trade deals, government jobs, or social events. And while many confraternities preached charity, some were deeply involved in public penance rituals that bordered on the performatively gruesome flagellation processions, hair shirts, fasting marathons. A few even got tangled in inquisitorial business, reporting on members who seemed a little too heretical or not quite holy enough. There's still debate among scholars about just how grassroots these organizations really were. Some argue they were genuine bottom-up expressions of lay spirituality, proof that regular people had agency in shaping religious life. Others say they were tools of control, subtly reinforcing church doctrine and civic order while offering the illusion of freedom. Both sides have a point. Confraternities empowered ordinary people and kept them in line. That's medieval efficiency for you. But what made them truly enduring was their adaptability. When plagues swept through Europe, confraternities took charge of caring for the sick and burying the dead. When political instability rocked cities, confraternities offered consistency and community. When people couldn't afford private masses or donations to monasteries, confraternities pooled resources so everyone could get a slice of salvation. They filled in the gaps that neither the church nor the state could consistently manage. And here's the kicker. They're still around. Modern mutual aid societies, religious orders, social clubs, and charitable foundations, all of them owe something to the medieval confraternity model. Ever been to a pancake breakfast at a church? That's a confraternity with better branding. Food, pantry, volunteers, confraternity, energy. That committee at your parish that organizes everything from weddings to fixing the boiler. Total confraternity vibes. These organizations were supposed to be supplements, not institutions. But they became the lifeblood of medieval urban life. They created networks of support, identity, and belonging that went beyond class or occupation. And in doing so, they showed that even in an era dominated by monarchs and popes, Real power sometimes came from a bunch of regular people with candles, schedules, and a deep fear of being forgotten. So next time you see a fundraising car wash with matching t-shirts and slightly chaotic energy, just smile. You're witnessing the spiritual descendants of a medieval experiment that was never meant to last. And the streets are humming with something new, a language that isn't Latin. It's not exactly French either. It's richer, more musical, full of odd vowels and flourishes. You follow the sound into a courtyard where a young man in an absurdly tight tunic strums a lute and recites poetry to an audience of sighing nobles. He's not a priest or a scholar or a knight. He's something else entirely, a troubadour. And even though everyone assumes his songs are just a passing cries romantic fluff for bored aristocrats, he's part of a movement that will echo through centuries of literature, music, and even modern celebrity culture. What began as courtly entertainment ends up changing the way we think about love, fame, and feelings. And yes, even your favorite playlist owes something to this guy in tights. Troubadours. Those wandering poet musicians of medieval southern France didn't invent music or poetry, but they did invent a particular brand of it that was unlike anything Europe had seen before. Their songs weren't about saints or kings or epic battles. They were about desire, yearning, longing, the pain of unrequited love, often for someone entirely off limits, like a noblewoman married to a powerful lord, the kind of love you weren't supposed to have, but couldn't help feeling, the kind of love that was elevated to a virtue, simply because it was impossible. This became known as courtly love, a concept so powerful and emotionally messy that we're still wrestling with it. 800 years later, it was romantic, yes, but also coded, ritualized, and often hopeless. In the typical song, the lady is distant, aloof, morally superior. The troubadour is tortured, humble, willing to suffer endlessly for just a glance. It's basically every emo lyric written between 1995 and 2007. Just with more falconry metaphors. And here's the quirky fact. A lot of this poetry was written not by dusty old men, but by young, ambitious, social climbers. Troubadours often came from the lower nobility or merchant class. Some were even women, the troubadours who flipped the script and sang about men with equal parts sass and sorrow. It wasn't about who you were. It was about whether you could perform. A well-crafted verse could open doors at court, earn you a patron, or get you invited to the castle's next poetry slam. It was like a medieval open mic night, with better costumes and slightly higher stakes. At first, the whole thing looked temporary, a fad, a distraction for nobles with too much time and too few wars. But it spread like wildfire from Occitania to northern France, from Italy to Spain. By the time it hit the courts of Eleanor of Aquitaine and her famously literary entourage, troubadour culture was no longer fringe. It was fashion. Knights were composing poems between battles. Queens were commissioning verse about their pet swans. Poetry had become a social currency, and the influence didn't stop there. These songs began to reshape literature itself. The medieval epic was slowly edged out by the romantic narrative. The ideal hero was no longer the brutish warrior, but the sensitive lover, Lancelot, Tristan, Romeo. Eventually, love stories got darker, more tragic, more psychological. All because some guy with a lute wouldn't stop whining about how pretty Lady Beatrice looked during Vespers. Now, scholars still argue about just how real all this was. Did troubadours actually feel this anguish sure? Were they just milking the poetic formula? Was courtly love a reflection of genuine cultural change, or just elaborate literary cosplay? Either way, it worked. It gave people, especially women, a new kind of visibility in literature. Ladies were no longer just prizes to be won. They had moral authority. They were muses, judges, occasionally even poets themselves. And the legacy is still here. Every time you listen to a breakup song, watch a romantic comedy, or read a novel about star-crossed lovers who tragically just miss each other at the airport, you're swimming in the wake of troubadour culture. The idea that love should be hard, that longing is noble, that suffering somehow purifies emotion, that all came from here. It's beautiful. It's exhausting. It's very medieval. Imagine being a 13th century noblewoman listening to a troubadour's new song. Maybe your marriage was arranged. Maybe your life is full of duty and protocol. But here comes this scruffy poet singing about your beauty, like it's the sun breaking through the clouds. He can't love you not openly, but that's what makes it so thrilling. You smile, say nothing, and when he leaves, you commission a song in response, quietly, anonymously, because you know how the game is played. What began as flirtation evolved into cultural identity. Troubadours weren't just entertainers. They were artists, influencers, manipulators of feeling, and their songs survived, written down, memorized, performed again and again. Some even got copied across law. Here's your quirky fact. Student riots were a regular feature of medieval universities. These were not calm, gentle institutions. Students fought landlords over rent. They brawled with townspeople, threw furniture out windows, and occasionally barricaded themselves in halls over tuition fees. In 1229, a dispute between students and Parisian police turned so ugly that the university literally shut down for 2 years and moved to other cities in protest. Academic strike doesn't quite capture the drama, more like a traveling intellectual circus with a Latin vocabulary and no off switch. And yet these chaotic centers of learning began to standardize. The trivium and quadrivium, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy formed the foundation of the arts curriculum. From there, students could move on to higher faculties, law, medicine, or theology. You started as a bachelor baccalaureus, worked your way to master or doctor, and hopefully ended up with enough clout to lecture other people for the rest of your life. It was the first real system of degrees, a ladder of education that's still with us today, of course. It wasn't all enlightenment and glory. The universities were deeply tied to the church, and most of the curriculum was filtered through a theological lens. Aristotle was rediscovered, but only after being scrubbed for compatibility with Catholic doctrine. Disagreeing with the wrong text could get you excommunicated, or worse, and women. Don't even think about it. Medieval universities were rigidly male spaces. The only women involved were occasionally in the background, copying manuscripts, endowing buildings, or being quietly brilliant in convents. Still, the scope was incredible. By the 13th century, universities were producing legal experts who shaped kingdoms. doctors who pushed medicine beyond superstition, and theologians whose dense Latin arguments could make or break church councils. Scholasticism with all its dry syllogisms and hair-splitting distinctions was born here. And while today it might sound insufferable to spend 10 years debating whether angels could move through time in its day, this was the cutting edge. This was thought happening in real time. And that's what scholars still wrestle with. Were these universities forces of progress or bastions of conformity? Some historians argue they stifled creativity, churning out dogma and bureaucrats. Others see them as the foundation of modern intellectual freedom. The answer is probably both. They were slow, conservative, and elitist, but also the first places where knowledge was systematically shared, challenged, and preserved across generations. Imagine being a 14th century student at Oxford. You're broke, you're cold, and you're living off boiled cabbage and wine of questionable legality. But you're also part of something extraordinary. You attend lectures by candlelight. You argue theology in the tavern. You help copy the sentences of Peter Lombard by hand until your wrist screams. You may not know it, but you're part of the invention of the academy, not just as a place, but as an idea. And when you graduate, if you graduate too, might return to your hometown as the one person who can read Latin fluently. You'll advise bishops, draw up contracts, or teach the next wave of overture scholars. And slowly, that temporary solution to Europe's knowledge problem becomes a pillar of its identity. By the end of the Middle Ages, universities weren't going anywhere. They had buildings, patrons, traditions, alumni networks, and enough Latin jargon to wallpaper a cathedral. And when the Renaissance hit, they were ready. Not always fast to adapt, but stable, structured, and there. So the next time you grumble about student debt, group projects, or dense professors with three-piece suits and no awareness of time limits, remember this. The system was never meant to last this long, but it did because people kept showing up, hungry for knowledge, or at least for the debate. What began as a fix for unreliable teachers became the blueprint for global education. Welcome to the long, strange legacy of the medieval university. Just don't get into a tavern fight over Plato again. The bell tolls across a gray sky in 15th century Prague, and you, a tired, middle-aged apprentice printer, are rubbing your ink-stained fingers together, trying to decide whether this latest German guy in town is brilliant, insane, or both. He's built a contraption, weirdly beautiful, monstrously finicky machine with movable metal letters that click into place like tiny soldiers. He says it'll change the world. You're just hoping it doesn't explode. The press rolls. The paper feeds through. And in that moment, something temporary and experimental becomes something unavoidable. Because this isn't just a printing machine. It's the start of the print revolution, a stopgap solution to a growing literacy problem that winds up reshaping everything from religion and politics to bedtime stories and internet comment sections. Let's back up. Before printing, every book in Europe had to be copied by hand, slowly, painstakingly, usually by monks whose eyesight and sanity didn't survive the process. A single Bible could take years to produce and cost more than most people's houses, so books were rare, precious, and often chained to desks, literally to keep them from wandering off If knowledge is power, then power was heavily bottlenecked. By the 14th century, things were starting to strain. Universities were popping up, trade was booming, literacy was creeping into the middle classes, and the old system of hand copying couldn't keep up. Enter block printing from East Asia. They were way ahead, which trickled into Europe through trade routes. At first, Europeans used woodblock printing, carving entire pages into slabs of wood. It worked great for playing cards and religious images, but not so great for actual books. Too slow, too fragile, too splintery. And then came Johannes Gutenberg with his wine press-inspired printing machine and his movable type system around the mid-15th century. He didn't invent the idea of printing, but he nailed the European version of it. His secret sauce, a clever combination of oil-based ink, durable metal type, and a press that could crank out hundreds of pages a day. Suddenly, books were no longer single, precious snowflakes. They were mass-producible objects. Here's your quirky fact. The first real blockbuster printed with movable type in Europe wasn't a tabloid, a play, or even a scandalous list of royal affairs. It was the Gutenberg Bible printed in the 1450s. It looked like a handwritten manuscript, with hand-painted decorations and wide margins. Gutenberg didn't want to scare people off. He wanted his new technology to blend in, which is kind of hilarious, considering how much it would blow everything up. Gutenberg thought he was building a better way to make Bibles. What he actually did was set off an information avalanche. Suddenly, knowledge wasn't confined to monasteries and elite libraries. Text could be duplicated quickly, cheaply, and widely. Universities exploded with printed material. Science got faster. Law became standardized. And just a few decades later, a monk named Martin Luther used the press to launch a reformation that shook the Catholic Church to its core. Luther's 95 Theses went viral the old-fashioned way, nailed to a door, copied, printed, and distributed like wildfire. And scholars still debate whether printing caused the Renaissance or simply amplified it. Either way, the press turned a trickle of classical knowledge into a flood. Ancient texts, previously hoarded or half forgotten, were suddenly back in circulation. Humanism gained steam. Artists, thinkers, scientists, all of them started riffing off each other, building momentum thanks to the printed word. A dialogue that used to take decades now happened in years. But printing didn't just revolutionize the learned elite. It began to reach ordinary people, too. Pamphlets, almanacs, folk tales, sermons, calendars, even printed indulgences. Yes, the literal paperwork you bought to shave years off your time in purgatory rolled off presses like lottery tickets. Literacy rates ticked up. Reading became personal, portable, and sometimes dangerous, because once people could read things for themselves, religious texts, political arguments, new ideas, they didn't always agree with the official version, which leads to one of the great ironies of medieval printing. It was born in the late Middle Ages, but it helped end them. The structures that had defined medieval Europe, church dominance, hereditary rule, oral tradition, were gradually destabilized by an invention, originally intended to make copying the Bible more efficient. Instead, it fueled revolutions, wars, reforms, and, eventually, democracy. It's easy to forget how clunky it all was at first. Early printers struggled with everything: warped type, misaligned pages, inky disasters. Censorship arrived almost instantly, because nothing scares the powerful like a book they didn't approve. Print shops were raided, licenses revoked, editors punished. Sound familiar? The idea that mass communication should be controlled didn't take long to develop. But the genie was out of the bottle, and what started as a tool for religious and scholarly elites slowly crept into every corner of life. Cookbooks, medical guides, love poems, joke books, astrology charts, newspapers, political cartoons. Soon, the press was less about sacred knowledge and more about everything: highbrow, lowbrow, and everything in between. And people didn't want to stop reading. They wanted more. They wanted it faster. Welcome to the birth of content addiction, now with woodcut illustrations. Imagine you're a literate, middle-class merchant in 1490s Nuremberg. 10 years ago, your bookshelf held 2 books and a psalter. Now it's full of printed volumes, some you bought, some you bartered for, some you've only half read. You're reading about